I know it's a it's a little suspect, starting with a Jesus song, but it's the boss, it's Springsteen. Come on. We can handle it, right? It's like you can't get rid of gospel. You can't, everybody has something to offer our spiritual lives. Okay, so here's what I'm trying to figure out. And I need your help. This year I realized that Rabban Gamliel was really on to something. Rabban Gamliel, one of the great sages of the Talmud and the Mishnah, has a famous saying. It's a saying, it's a teaching, it's a reminder. It's Rabban Gamliel's 3 things that we say on Passover. And as I start to say that, maybe it'll sound familiar because it's in the Haggadah. We read it every year. Rabban Gamliel appears sort of towards the end of the Magid section, the storytelling section of the Haggadah, and he insists that he reminds us to say 3 things. To make note of 3 things, it almost sounds like to hold up and show 3 things. And he says if we don't do that, then we won't have fulfilled our obligation. But let's take a look for a second at what they are. And I have to say, I always saw this as kind of it's like a PS in the Haggadah. It doesn't feel very substantial. It just feels like, listen, if by now you haven't mentioned these 3 things. So let's take a look. This is actually in the Mishnah. The Mishnah, the first rabbinic code. So it's very early that he's saying these things, but then it gets put into the Haggadah here. Here's the Haggadah, the table of contents for the Haggadah, and the Passover Seder, that is. And, we say blessings for the first few parts, and then we go into the Magid section. We tell them the story, and there are famous parts of the Magid section, like the 4 questions or the 4 sons. A lot of these, there's a lot in here. This is Passover. We're reading through this, the 10 plagues, Dayenu, and it's like Dayenu, right? Like that's enough. We're done at Dayenu. You would think that's almost like the definition of Dayenu. It's like we've had enough. And then all of a sudden we get to Rabban Gamliel's 3 things, and you can see it's like once we get there, we're done. We'll have a second cup of wine soon, and Rabban Gamliel. So it just sort of seems like, oh, by the way, if anyone hasn't said these 3 things, they have not fulfilled their obligation. So now let's go back to the Mishnah and see where we get that. Rabban Gamliel would say anyone who did not say these 3 matters on Passover has not fulfilled his obligation. Pesach, which is the name of the holiday, but refers to the Passover lamb, the Paschal offering. Pesach, matzah, and maror. Okay? And then he explains them a little bit. We'll get into that. But I just always thought, like, okay, fine, Rabban Gamliel. Of course, we've covered our obligations by now, but Rabban Gamliel wants to attach it to these 3 foods. And, okay, fine. So every Passover, we quickly read through his 3 foods. They're there on the table. We're going to make blessings over them soon, and then we move on. But I think I saw this year, I saw some deep understanding in Rabban Gamliel's triad here. There's something that Rabban Gamliel is teaching us about Passover that I think is fundamental. that I think is core. That these three objects actually speak to some like three important reference points for processing all of the Exodus story. And the place that I understood that Rabbi Gamliel was onto something was here in this week's Parsha, Parshat Beshalach. Parsha Beshalach. Okay, this week's Parsha is the Parsha with the crossing of the Red Sea, and then onward into the desert. It's almost like we've left Egypt behind, and yet you will see we're still dealing with the Egypt trauma in this Parsha, and Rabbi Gamliel is going to help us deal with that trauma. I hope that's not too vague. So we'll be using Rabbi Gamliel's formula here as we move forward. So let's take a break now, and then we'll back up and move into the Parsha more slowly. Okay, let's say a blessing over our Torah study, and try to get try to get to this is like the joy of Torah study, something you've been looking at for your whole life, and all of a sudden cracks open for you. And I would say it's not all the way open. I need your help. I still need to figure out exactly what Rabbi Gamliel is trying to teach us here. So let's say a blessing and hope for some of that learning. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so let's move just a little bit more slowly and go through Rabbi Gamliel's teaching again, and then I hope you'll see how Rabbi Gamliel is actually giving us something that will help guide us through this week's Parsha. So Rabbi Gamliel has these three things: the lamb, the matzah, and the bitter herbs. And you gotta say those three things. You gotta mention those three things. Really, it seems like what you have to do is you have to explain those three things. I just put a link in the chat to the source sheet if you want it. But here we're gonna go back to the source sheet. Okay, and Rabbi Gamliel, what he says is, now this is a little complicated because the Mishnah has different versions, and I will try to point out the original versions and what's been added later. Okay, so actually I'll bold it so you see. This is the original. Rabbi Gamliel would say, anyone who did not say these three matters on Passover has not fulfilled his obligation: Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. Okay, why Pesach? Why do you have to talk about the Paschal Lamb? Because the omnipresent, a word for God, God passed over the houses of our forefathers in Egypt, of our ancestors in Egypt. Okay, so that's in the original, and then over the years, people have inserted, and in the Haggadah, you will find an insertion, just an explanation of what he's talking about. So in last week's Parsha, in Parshat Bo, we were given the instructions to take a lamb and sacrifice it and eat from it. They were given those instructions even on that first Passover night. And the idea was that we were supposed to do this throughout the generations. And the reason that we do that is because it says, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Paschal offering, for God passed over the houses of the children in Israel, in Egypt. So the verb pasach, passed over, becomes the name of the Paschal offering, the Passover offering. It's the same in English as it is in Hebrew. It's just you take the verb and you map it onto the lamb. Okay, that does seem important. That is the reason that we have Passover, is because God spared us. That's the reason that Passover is called Passover, although it's not called Passover in the Torah. It's always called the festival of matzah. But okay, that's Passover. And then there are the other two items, and the other two items are matzah. And all that Rabbi Gamliel says is matzah because our forefathers were redeemed from Egypt. You can see over here in the Hebrew, but the Haggadah adds as it is stated, and they baked the dough that they took out of Egypt as cakes of matzah, for it was not leavened, as they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry. So that we probably know. Why do we have matzah? Because we had to rush out of Egypt. There wasn't time to bake bread. Okay, the lamb, because God passed over the houses, and that implies also that we put the lamb's blood on the door. We're evoking that moment. The matzah evokes the moment of leaving Egypt because we were rushing out of Egypt. And finally, what is the maror for? Well, that's almost too obvious, because maror is bitter herbs. The reason for the bitter herbs is because the Egyptians embittered our forefathers' lives in Egypt. And it actually says that in the Torah, and they embittered their lives with v'yamaru et chayehem. They embittered their lives with hard service in mortar and in brick and all manner of service in the field. All the service that they made them serve was with rigor. Okay, so these are the three touch points. The lamb, because God passed over our houses in Egypt. The matzah, because we rushed out, and then the maror, because our lives were bitter in Egypt. Those are three very different. Part of what we're going to try to do here now is fit these together. Why are these the three key components? The bitterness, the leaving, and the bitterness, the passing over, and then the leaving. This seems to be a triaxial a formula here. And Rabban Gamliel then goes on and says, now this is famous. In each generation, a person must view himself as though he personally left Egypt. But that's a later addition. And then there's like a bunch of praise, and therefore we are obligated to. The rest of the mission is not so important for our purposes today. I just want you to know those touch points. And I want to, before I pause a little for reflection, I want to just remind you where Rabban Gamliel is getting this. He didn't just make this up. These three items were eaten together on the night of the Exodus. They shall eat the flesh, habasar, the meat, that same night, and they shall eat it. I'm actually going to change this because I think I used the word meat later. We're going to see the word meat come up. They shall eat the meat that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with matzot, unleavened bread, it's translated here, but really matzot, with matzah, and with bitter herbs or maror. Okay? Now, let's just pause for a second, because this in itself is interesting, and it will help us as a contrast point for everything else we're going to explore. This is last week's Parsha. This is during the Exodus, and during the Exodus we find not Rabban Gamliel. The Torah commands that the children of Israel eat these foods all together. Now, Rabban Gamliel comes along and says those three foods are the key to understanding the Exodus. So let's just pause for a second, and maybe you've seen this before, perhaps, or maybe now you just look and you think, oh well, passing over the houses, the bitterness, the Exodus from Egypt, and the bitterness in Egypt. This makes sense to me. These three are the three because what? Does this make sense to anyone yet? Noah is always like our first shooter here.
Well, I can't say it makes sense. It's starting to slowly make sense, along with the teaching we had from last week from you about that weird verb, mameya, that along with that, for the Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, that I'm seeing it now as the different stages in their leaving. That in the Pesach, they're starting to eat a food that they'll be eating over and over, a meat that's maybe a symbol of freedom, because I'm sure the wealthy in Egypt always ate meat, and the much better foods rather than bread and crackers and whatnot. The matzah that ties directly into the mamea that they had to leave in haste and they couldn't really tarry. And the
Mm-hmm.
maror, one because they're leaving and the bitterness of leaving the comfort that they had and in going to something new.
Okay, okay, good. So Noah does the intuitive thing here, which is to try to create a kind of progression. I was doing it myself, a kind of chronology. Oh, okay. I guess it starts with the bitterness in of life in Egypt, and then crisis point is God comes to wreak havoc and spares the Israelites. So it seems like we're going to make it, and then we make it out. So then it goes um, uh, bitterness, Passover, the lamb, and then the rush of the Exodus. And there's a storyline there, but I don't know. Still, why these three things? And I want to say, as we continue to probe that question, if you look at the verse in the Torah, it's true that you eat all three of them together. But what's most important? What's most important? What is the central act here? It's the Paschal offering, the sacrifice. And the fact that they eat it with matzot and maror almost seems incidental. It almost seems like just the toppings on your sandwich, right? Like just flavor it up a little bit. Like these symbols, and they're not explained in the Torah. The Torah doesn't say maror because they embittered your life. Rabbi Gamliel makes that connection, right? Matzah, we haven't explained yet why matzah will be the bread of haste. Okay, but like the point is you eat the lamb because the lamb is the very thing that will deliver you. We start to call the holiday after the lamb. The lamb is central. Now, of course, the strangest thing about this point that I'm making is that now we don't eat the lamb at all, right? Because we don't have a temple and we don't make sacrifices. So now the matzah and the maror have come to take the pride of position, but in the Torah, it's definitely the lamb. So it's funny to accentuate those other items and to say, oh, these are the items. Now, as I say that, I can hear myself answering, well, what matzah becomes the most central item? Okay, that's true. Matzah becomes another crucial way of thinking about Passover. But maror is still a little curious. That's nowhere in our story does it seem like maror is a crucial part of the understanding of Passover until Rabbi Gamliel comes along and says, because they embittered your lives. Don't you get why you're told to eat maror? And it's like, oh, maybe you're right. That sounds right. But it wasn't explicit. Okay. So let's just take a few more thoughts on processing what it is that's going on here in this triad and in the sandwiching of this literal sandwiching of this triad. Let's hear from Yonatan.
Rabbi, I'm so grateful to you for bringing up this question because every year, I mechanically read over Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, and I've been to enough of your classes now that I feel like I'm starting to think about these things in the way that you're trying to train us to think about them. And I think you can parse this like a million different ways. But what's coming to my mind right now, you asked, why are these three things essential to understanding the Exodus, right? So why did we come out of Egypt? We came out of Egypt to worship God in the desert, right? Explicitly. And when you look at these three food items and what they represent, the Paschal sacrifice had to be eaten communally, right? If your family was not big enough to really eat it communally, Parshat Bo tells us you brought over your neighbors and you all ate it together. Matzah, I think, represents humility. We know that the Israelites actually did have time for their bread to rise. They got enough notice to bake bread, and yet they still had to eat matzah to accommodate the Erev Rav that came with them, the mixed multitude. And it represents humbling ourselves, bringing ourselves down to a simpler level. Maror, I think, represents empathy, empathy with pain, and experiencing pain in a way that's actually safe to experience pain, rather than some kind of like self harm. And I think what we're saying is like when you do a mitzvah, when you go and like try to commune with God in this way, you need these three things. You need humility, sorry, you need community, you need humility, and you need empathy for that to be successful.
Okay, beautiful. So that's first of all, it's a beautiful drasha, meaning like that's the sort of that's Passover Torah right there, and that is the sort of symbolic mapping that we do when we come to the Haggadah and try to make meaning of all of the language and the symbols in front of us. And Rabbi Gamliel gives us some connections. Yonatan builds on those and tries to identify kind of what is the core value or virtue in each of these experiences. So that's another excellent way of thinking about this triad, what it's doing here. And I want to pick up on the last thing that Yonatan said, that the maror is about empathy, a sense of being able to internalize, to feel the experience of our ancestors. Because after all, remember what the Mishnah goes on to say, every person must see themselves as if they left Egypt, right? As if they personally left Egypt. And one of the ways that we do that is we eat bitterness so that we can feel a little of the bitterness. I'm saying a very obvious thing here. This is not a, but maybe all of the foods that we ingest are meant to internalize a certain kind of experience. So you could feel like as the matzah goes down your throat, the rush of having to crunch through a hasty cracker meal, right? So it is when we eat the Passover lamb, we feel, we internalize, we literally digest the feeling of salvation. So maybe what Rabbi Gamliel is saying is that it's these virtues or these moments or these experiences, these touch points, but it's food that takes us into the empathetic relationship with the Passover story. And that's the one we're really trying to get to so that we feel as if we have left Egypt. Okay, I see a lot of hands up and I will come back to them, but I want to get somewhere into this week's Parsha a little bit before we run out of too much time. And so I want to just the Rabban Gamliel, we could stay on forever. We could come up with lots of different triadic readings of Rabban Gamliel. But what I noticed this year was, and I think I started to notice it on Passover, and now I've been thinking about it since. But what I noticed this year is that Parshat Beshalach has the actual like post-Exodus fleeing, and then the crossing of the Red Sea. Fine, and the crossing of the Red Sea is really the big deal in Parshat Beshalach. We refer to the Shabbat of Parshat Beshalach as Shabbat Shira, the Sabbath of song, because of the song at the sea. So this is the big event, the main event in Parshat Beshalach. But after the main event, after the crossing of the Red Sea, suddenly the Israelites begin their wandering through the desert, and they wouldn't you know it, they encounter these food items again, all three of them, but in slightly different form. Okay? So if you trust me, I want to take you on a little bit of a tour of this week's Parsha through the prism of Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. And I hope that you will, as I did, feel sort of astonished, a sense of wonder at seeing Rabban Gamliel's triad appear here as well. So let's just take a look at what I'm talking about, and then we'll try to figure out what's going on here in this re-articulation. I might even say transformation. I might even say transubstantiation, since we began with Christian thought. Transubstantiation of these food items. Okay, let's take a look here. the very first thing that happens, the very, very first thing that happens after the song at the sea, like here, I'll prove it to you, is here's the song of the sea. Miriam finishes out the song of the sea. And then the very next thing that happens is that the people wander into they set out from the sea and they wander into the wilderness or the desert, and they traveled 3 days in the desert and they found no water. Okay, now just look at the language here of the place, but don't worry, you won't need to figure it out because the Torah actually names it for you. They came to Mara. Mara. Now, if you were really keen, you would remember maror and think, hey, Mara, bitterness again. Does this mean bitterness? Does the place, but maybe like me, you would just read it and not notice. Mara sounds like a nice name. So they came to Mara, but they couldn't drink the water of Mara because it was bitter. Oh, wait a minute. That's why it was named Mara. Oh, Mara means bitter because the waters there are bitter. Okay. Now, take a look at this word here, marorim, bitter herbs, and this word here, bitters. Okay? If that isn't a kind of a hint, a clue, a callback, I don't know what is, but it's not like it's not like just a one-word callback. You've got in one verse, you've got 4 mentions of bitter, 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 bitter. And then what happens? The people grumble against Moses and they say, what shall we drink? So he cried out to God, and God showed him a piece of wood and he threw it into the water. V'yimteku hamayim. And the water became sweet. Okay. Now here we begin. We're gonna do this 2 more times, but this is what I'm talking about. We have Rabban Gamliel's 3 things that you need to know about Passover. It isn't just Rabban Gamliel's little Devar Torah. It's embedded in the language of a verse in last week's Parsha where these 3 things are eaten together. That it seems God wanted for us to have these 3 items in our mouths. And then the people cross over. They like literally cross over. Now everything has changed, but they encounter bitterness again. Isn't bitterness Egypt? Why is it the first thing they encounter as they head out of Egypt is bitterness? But they complain to Moses. Moses cries out to God, and God sweetens the water. Now they have sweet water. Okay. Anybody want to try to like deal with this? I will soon move on to think about matzah and Pesach. But anyone want to deal with this dilemma here? This dilemma of like the bitters of Egypt were a remembrance of our bitter. Sorry, I'm not saying this well. The bitter herbs are in memory of the bitterness of our lives in Egypt. But we leave Egypt, and the first thing we encounter is bitterness. But it's okay because God sweetens it. So that like maybe there's an obvious lesson in there, or maybe there's a deeper lesson in there. I'm not sure. Can someone try to articulate it for me? So I see Jen's hand just went up, and then I'll call him Matt.
Sort of 2 phrases that I've learned in my training come to mind, and one is misery is the path out of hell. Meaning if you want to get out of a place where you're stuck in suffering, it's not good times. It's not fun times. It's usually a lot of work and it's a lot of pain. And sometimes it's actually reflecting on pain that you've not been reflecting on for a long time. So they get out of a place where there was so much pain that they could not reflect on. And now that pain is coming up into their conscious experience. And the other phrase that I think of is that pain is only suffering when it has no meaning, right? If you are experiencing bitterness because you've been enslaved and there's no movement forward, you are stuck, right? That bitterness is suffering. But if you experience bitterness when you're on the path to liberation, that bitterness is experienced differently because it has meaning.
Good. Okay. I'll try to just briefly, I want to note, I'm noting these for myself. Jen said it well enough, but just for myself, I want to just note these 2 points because I think they're both important. One is that it isn't over. It's not over. They have left Egypt, but they had a whole experience, hundreds of years. They had trauma, and you don't just drop that. And so they are still processing and still encountering. The bitterness of Egypt has not been purged entirely. And okay, so that's one thing to just note, that this is a callback to something that is being left behind, but clearly not fully being left behind. And then the other thing is that there is, though, it isn't just unmitigated bitterness, more bitterness, unceasing bitterness, just suffering forever. There is an attempt to deal with this. Now, I don't know if it's sophisticated to just complain, but they're getting some indication here that this bitterness can be worked through, can be processed, can be dealt with, can be can be transformed. Okay, Matt. Can't hear you, Matt. Can't hear you. No, it was scratchy. Yeah. It wasn't that there was no sound.
Am I?
Yes,
how about
hear you now. Yes.
Now, okay.
Yep.
I was going to say that the meat is the Cain and Abel sacrifice, and that we were getting that. But I read along with the altar translation as we do class to see if he has anything. And he points out that we start off with the Egyptians can't drink water, can't drink from the Nile. And that we're starting off here with the can't drinking is, I think, a meaningful telling connection. And right. I think that may be as much of that, since we're going to be not drinking and struggling with that, and that's an ongoing forever thing. I think that's, if it's the bitterness there, it's also telling us that's an ongoing forever thing.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's interesting. The altar connection is really interesting. The Egyptians started by not being able to drink water, so there's a kind of a replaying, and this picks up on what Jen was just saying, that there is a kind of exploration of the trauma and the story. Like this is somehow echoing whatever happened back then is somehow echoing as we move forward. And what was the second thing you said, Matt?
I turn off. No. It's ongoing. That it's a forever thing.
Right. Right. And this, like, crying out for water is going to become the most sort of they're in the desert after all, and so there is some, this is not the transition from slavery to freedom, is not a transition from bitter to sweet. It's a transition from one bitterness to another bitterness. But this bitterness can be sweetened, either because they've learned how to process bitterness now, or because there's something different about this bitterness. Okay? Like, something has changed that allows for the sweetening of what is bitter. Now, I'm going to turn back to folks to think more about this, but again, want to make sure that we actually see what's going on in Parsha B'Shalach. So let me just name the other forces here, or the other items on Rabban Gamliel's shopping list, because the bitter water has become sweet. What comes next? They leave after this, and then they're complaining more, and they say, if only we had died by God in the land of Egypt, b'shivtenu al sira basar, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate our fill of bread. You've brought us out to starve us. Okay. And there you have, in the meat and the bread, you can already see the triad rounding out here, right? We spoke of meat on Passover, and matzah, after all, is another form of bread. In fact, it's even called the bread of affliction or poverty. So it's not a stretch to say that that we've got bitters, and the two other items we're looking for here are bread and meat. That is, in fact, what they start complaining about as something that they had in Egypt. And the answer is not eat more matzah. The answer is I will another surprising transformation of from bitter herbs to bitter water to sweet water. So from matzah to lechem, min hashamayim, bread from the heavens, manna, from matzah to manna. Okay, so this is nice. They're going to have bread from the heavens. And then finally, just a little further down, God doesn't seem happy. God spoke to Moses and said, I've heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Speak to them and say, by evening you shall have meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread, and you shall know that I Adonai am your God. And what happens? In the evening, quail appeared and covered the camp. And then in the morning, there was the fall of dew about the camp, and when the fall of dew lifted, there over the surface of the wilderness lay a fine and flaky substance. And that's the manna. Okay? So now you see it. Now you see what I'm getting at. All three foods are sort of reappearing here just after the crossing of the Red Sea, but they're all a little different now. They're all a little different now. The bitter herbs reappears in the form of bitter water, which is then sweetened. The bread of affliction reappears in the form of bread from heaven, which has to be collected every day. And the meat of the Passover lamb is now also coming down from heaven in the form of quail meat. Okay, so I think you see what, like, this is quite striking. Rabbi Gamliel is on to something, because it isn't just that bitterness can be transformed, but that somehow the very sandwich that made up Passover, those touch points, and remember, passing over our houses in Egypt, the actual Exodus and the haste, the bitterness of Egypt, that's why we ate those things. But we're now taking those three things and transforming each of them to get to what? To get to what? We started to do this with the water. Now, what else are we seeing? What is the manna and the quail in these continued transformations teaching us about what's going on here? What does Rabbi Gamliel want us to be noticing here? So I'll start with Ariella, who's nodding.
Well, that we're being sustained from above. Like, it's coming from a source beyond us. And just like in Egypt, the oppression was others oppressing us, now as we're worshiping and serving God, that our sustenance is coming from above.
Beautiful, succinct, and perfectly put. I mean, that's in some ways the lesson of this. If we wanted to, we can get complicated, but if we wanted to state it in the most straightforward way, I think Ariella did that for us, because the real message here is right here: bread from heaven, min hashamayim. And so the bread comes down from heaven, and so the meat even comes down from heaven, which is, I mean, once you say it's a bird, it's like, oh, that's how it happened. It's not like a crazy thing that a bird should fly down, but it's still that directionality that Ariella is noticing. Bread comes from heaven. Your meat comes from heaven. Duh, what's the message here? Look to your help from Ma'ayan Yavo Izri. From where does my help come? From God, from above. Okay. And so even the water, which seemed like, oh, well, that's different. God sweetens it. But it's like, the water is bitter. You need to look above in order to, because the water of Egypt comes famously up from below, right? Like Egypt is watered by the overflowing of the Nile. So as a kind of landscape, it's the opposite of the desert, and as a kind of directionality in the desert, and eventually in the land of Israel, you will have to look above and pray for your water. Okay, so what Ariel is saying is like that's got to be at the heart of it. Is that for all of these items, you used to depend on the Egyptians for this, or you had to eat a poverty version of this because you're trying to leave Egypt, right? Now, how will you find? They won't have to eat matzah for 40 years. They'll eat this flaky, like sort of bread-like substance, but it comes from above. And they have to collect it every single day. That's a part of the manna experience, is that it isn't just, a storehouse of manna, but that it has to, every day they'll have to turn to God and hope for more and hope for more. So that is like, I think Ariella is really like giving us the sort of the foundation for all of the most basic transformative experience, which is the transformation of like looking downward to looking upward. Okay, all right. Let's explore a little further. Emily.
Yeah, the comment I wanted to make has to do with the bitterness, and in relation to the story of when the Israelites crossed the sea and then they're chastised by God not to celebrate so much because all these Egyptians died. So I've always thought of this bitterness as what we carry around, what we do to others, how we oppress others, and that we have to, transform that into not oppressing others. And so I've been struggling a little bit with how that fits with the maror and the matzah, but to me it seems that if these resources come from God, from heaven, then also so does the resource for changing ourselves so that we don't oppress others.
Yeah. Your comment feels to me like a direct commentary on Jen's comment earlier, right? That the bitterness continues, that there's a continued need to process it, that the trauma lingers, but the way you put it, Emily, it's like, yeah, and so the question becomes, how is it that you go through such a terrible experience and not just carry bitterness around with you for the rest of your life and spit bitterness to anyone you encounter? How will you not be an embittered person? That's hard. I mean, what they dealt with was not the kind of the beyond the kind of struggles that I deal with. But it isn't just looking to God for transformation and sustenance. It's like, can God transform us? Can God, and I think that's an open question, can God sweeten our experience of the world and of ourselves when we have suffered so much? And that's part of the, so we can empathize, as Yonatan said, by ingesting the maror, but can we also tap into the liberation, to the transformation, to the sweetening, to the there are real questions here about what it is that we're carrying around and what it will take to let it go, right? Those are really, really good questions. Okay, time for a couple more folks. Richard.
Yes, maybe in the same vein, I wanted to point out that in verse 23, where they encounter the bitter water, there's an interesting ambiguity where it says they couldn't drink it because it was bitter, ki marim haim, and the haim is ambiguous as to whether the waters were bitter or they were bitter. And I think the whole notion that they're carrying the bitterness and the agency that we have to take these symbols, which are symbols of torture and pain, and have the resilience to flip them, like flipping over the matzah to the, bread of freedom.
Ooh.
And so I'm watching that happen in real time as these symbols are re-encountered and transmogrified really seems powerful to me.
That is powerful. I mean, that's just a great drash there. Look at this. This is good. This is a very keen reading that Richard offers us here. They couldn't drink the waters of Mara because Marimhem, because it was bitter. The waters in Hebrew is plural, Mayim. And so the waters, they were bitter. But so let's make this clear in the English, because they were bitter. But that, Richard says, could be that the people were bitter. And that's just a very powerful way to think of it. Everything was bitter to them. That they couldn't, their experience of the world was bitterness. And so everything they tasted was bitter. They couldn't break out of that. It was their perception that had to be, their experience of the world that had to be transformed. That is a beautiful reading there. And not wild, very rooted in the words of the text. So that's really nice. Okay, Leah Matsui.
New boss, new rules. They're actually surrounded by meat because they crossed over with lots of livestock. It's on the hoof. Have a barbecue. What's the problem? So I think they're working actually, yes, they're complaining terribly, awful, hard-headed, very ungrateful. And yet they're struggling with choice, maturity, and a new kind of responsibility. The last meat we eat in slavery is commanded by Hashem for us to eat. And until Hashem says, go ahead, kill another lamb, we are inundated with lambs. I think we're told there are even camels that crossed over, anachronistically. We don't touch them. So we are showing some kind of self-control. We're struggling with it, although we're complaining a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. That is really interesting. There is this way, and so they left Egypt, and they were told that they left with livestock. Why do they always complain about meat? That's a good question. And the meat, I must say, in our analysis so far, the meat is a bit of an outlier, because we really had a strong callback to the bitterness. We get to that. That's not a coincidence when you get to a place and it says bitter, 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 bitter after you've just left bitterness. So that feels like and there's bitter waters. There's like a substance of bitterness. It's feels like a direct callback. The bread from heaven also feels like, oh, matzah was the special bread, but now there's a new special bread, and it's a totally different kind of experience. Okay, so quail comes down, but it mentioned very quickly in passing. Has there really been a transformation? Am I just shoving this in the meat? And Leah's question makes it even stronger. Wasn't there other kinds of, what is it to be learned here from the experience of the quail? Now, I must say, the real drama of the quail comes later. So just as we round out, I think because I do think that the maror and the matzah are kind of more direct parallels there. I want to just make the case for the quail being that third item, their sort of relationship to meat itself is also something that they will continue to struggle with for the rest of for the rest of this journey. And so let's just take a look for 1 second at another episode. As after they've left Mount Sinai, are wandering into the desert. Let's see here. This is in the book of Numbers, much later on. The riffraff, great translation of a great word, ha'asapsuf. The riffraff in their midst felt a gluttonous craving, and when the Israelites wept and said, "If only we had meat to eat," We remember the fish that we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. And now our gullets are shriveled. There's nothing at all. Nothing but this manna to look to. So this is like it's another classic moment of the Israelites sort of crying out and complaining. But there's an irony, and because they say they have manna, but they're tired of manna. They don't want manna. What they want is meat. Now, what are we supposed to think of that? God is raining down bread from heaven. On the one hand, be grateful. On the other hand, same thing every day. So what are we supposed to think? I don't know. But it's always a little uneasy when they're saying, we'd like to go back to Egypt. We'd like to, what? Like, could you really, is this really what you want? You really want to go back to slavery? So look at how God responds here. We have just enough time to see this before we close. So God says, say to the people, sanctify yourselves, and you shall eat meat. For you have kept whining before God and said, if only we had meat to eat. Indeed, we were better off in Egypt. Well, God will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, not 2, not even 5 days or 10 or 20, but a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils. Ad asher yetze me'apchem, and becomes loathsome to you, for you have rejected God who is among you by whining before God and saying, oh, why did we ever leave Egypt? And then the quail come back. A wind from God started up, swept quail from the sea, and strewed them over the camp, about a day's journey on this side and about a day's journey on that side, all around the camp, some 2 cubits deep on the ground. And the people set to gathering quail all that day and night, and all the next day. Even the one who gathered the least had 10 chomers, and they spared them. They spread them out all around the camp. That's a weird detail. And then I just like, this is a very scary closing. The meat was still between their teeth, not yet chewed, when the anger of God blazed forth against the people and struck the people with a very severe plague. And the place was named Kivrot HaTava, that is the graves of craving, because the people who had the craving were buried there. Now, that's not a fun place to end our discussion. That's not a fun place to end this story. We've been seeing water made sweet. We see bread come down from the heavens. But there's something uneasy about this dependency. This, on the one hand, Ariella was exactly right. We should be looking to God. And on the other hand, there's some other version of looking to God that is going to be problematic, which is just, we want this, we want more, we want that. There's a kind of, we want to be treated in this strange way, the way we were treated in Egypt, where we had no agency, but we were sustained by our masters. And that God seems to be unhappy with. Okay, so there's too much here to like wrap this up. There's too much going on here, and I would say that each one of these cases, in fact, I should give you my Devar Torah from this week, if you want to read more about like the various trials and tests that they go through in this week's Parsha. Each one is distinct, and the lesson of the manna is not exactly the lesson of the quail, is not exactly the lesson of the bitter waters. But Rabban Gamliel is definitely onto something. Rabban Gamliel is right to say we really have to keep an eye on these 3 items, because they will mark for us 3 signal points in the tracking of the transformation of the children of Israel into an independent people, which is going to take 40 years. And in the meantime, they have to learn to trust God. So these are some of the basic themes, but the way that these themes get filtered through these 3 items, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, makes it a remarkable thing when we realize that Rabban Gamliel pointed that out, and that Rabban Gamliel pointed that out because the Torah, even as they were leaving Egypt, was already signaling these 3 items. And the Torah was already saying, eat these 3 items, because somehow this experience of eating the Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, this will be an experience that you will come back to again and again and again, and be kind of transforming, reflecting on, reprocessing, relearning. And so we won't wrap this all up in a bow, but I think we've gotten somewhere. we got a little bit deeper, and maybe this Passover it'll all finally click into place. Wishing you a Shabbat Shalom and a good rest of your week. Bye, everyone.